Welcome to Insubstantial. This is the podcast where we explore ideas and challenge assumptions. I'm Gabor. Before we get into the topic of the day, allow me to apologize for the quality of the sound in this episode. I upgraded my mic for a higher-end model and it turned out to be defective. I have done what I could with the sound, so I hope you will still be able to enjoy this conversation. Today, we're talking about circular economy. You probably heard the term. Maybe you think of recycling or reducing waste, or just being more sustainable. And yes, that's part of it. But the circular economy goes much deeper. It challenges how our entire economy works. It's a shift away from the take, make, throw away model towards something regenerative, where materials and values stay in use, where systems are designed not for disposal, but for renewal. Sounds great in theory, but in practice, it raises some big questions. How do we redesign products for reuse? How do we make circular systems economically viable? What about international trade or intellectual property or inequality between countries? To help us explore all this, I'm joined by Dr. Engineer Phillip Wallat. He is the founder of Deface Strategy Systems and an expert in circular engineering. He works with companies to redesign not just their products, but the entire process behind them, to build systems that are smarter, more efficient, and more sustainable. So today, we'll explore what circular economy really means, how it works in practice, and what are the demands from our industries, our policies, and not least of ourselves. Let's begin. Let's start with the basics, because before we dive into policies and technologies, we need to understand what we actually mean by circular economy. So, could you maybe introduce yourself a little bit further and then explain what the phrase circular economy gets used often, but it means different things to different people? And how do you personally define the circular economy? What do you see as its most important departure from traditional linear models?
Yeah, thank you first of all for the invitation to the podcast. Very interesting. And yeah, my name is Phillip Wallat. I'm in Clausthal-Zellerfeld, in the heart of Germany, basically. And there is a university called Clausthal University of Technology, which is very into circular economy itself and also different designs and disciplines. So therefore, I made my PhD there regarding this topic and also all the other theses. And it was followed by some kind of grant to transfer the academic knowledge into a viable business model, which I'm up to do now. And so circular economy is a term you can chew on a lot because there's so much different perspective to it and different areas. And I focus on the engineering design for circular economy. So how to make your products last longer or to be better recycled later on. And to get to your first question regarding misconceptions of circular economy, most of the time you hear the term recycling regarding circular economy, but it's so much more than just recycling. It's also design for reuse, repair, be able to repair a material which is broken later on in the life cycle of the product. And also how to design the materials in a way that I can rely on the stable market for those materials. So there's a lot of changes in the world every time. And how can I source as a company my material to build my products and also supply parts for the broken down parts for the consumer itself later on.
In engineering, we often focus on performance and cost, but circularity also means considering environmental impact and social fairness. How do you bring together those different dimensions in your work, and what kind of trade-offs or synergies have you encountered?
Yeah, so there's a pyramid from Maslow. So basically, what are the basic needs of a person and what are more sophisticated needs? What's a luxury? And so first of all, you have to look into the product which is produced by some company to fulfill a certain need of a person. And therefore, you can change the outcome of the product. If it's a luxury good, you have so much more possibilities to design a product But if it's more for the basic needs, you have to take into account that cost is a very important part of the design process. And if there's more or less, like a car is always a good example, it's somewhere in between a luxury good or something to work with. So therefore, the car has a main function is to transport material or persons from A to B, and this is the main function. And then you have additional functions like electrical windows, heating, and so on. And in my opinion, it's always important to make the main function of a product as performant as possible, but then you can adjust all the side functions regarding those main functions. And if so, then you can sacrifice some kind of performance, which the engineer never likes to hear, to sacrifice performance for recyclability of the product itself. And this is one of the first trade-offs you can make to have a product which is even possible to recycle or to be better recyclable, so that the secondary material is cheaper or in a higher quality or demand for the next step in the process in the circular economy.
As circular economy ideas become more popular, they also risk being misunderstood or oversimplified. What are some of the misconceptions you encounter that you think should be challenged?
And that circular economy is just green approaches to make some very low quality materials. There are also, for example, if you have plastic cutlery for your grill events or so, there's always written something like recyclability or so on that, and it's very flimsy and so on. So this is one of the misconceptions. I think that circular products are always a little bit cheaper than the original good ones. If you design a product very well for the circular economy, then you can also invest more material because your product lasts longer and therefore can increase the quality of your product. And the value of a product is, in my opinion, always the quality in terms of costs. So if I have higher costs, but a much more higher quality of my product, then I have a possibility to make a even nicer product and better fulfilling product for the need of the consumer. And so it's not just make cheap material, depending on what you would like to do, design for recycle, use lower amounts of material for the process and for the product, but you can also have a possibility to increase the amount of material because your product lasts longer, and therefore it's justified to invest a little bit more material there. And therefore have a product which lasts longer, which the consumer, depending on what kind he would like to do with it, gets more or less familiar with, and then have no direct need to exchange it for the next version of your product because your first version was already a little bit better than for the linear economy.
Okay, that big picture framing is important, but circularity becomes real at the product level. The choices engineers and designers make early on can shape the entire life cycle of a product. Most of what determines whether a product can be reused or recycled happens at this design stage. What role do design methods like design for disassembly or design for reuse play in shaping truly circular products?
Yeah, now we go a little bit deeper into the topic itself. So a product consists out of assemblies, and the assemblies have parts and the parts have materials. So there's this multi-layer of material. And if I have a product which may be designed for remanufacture, and then you have different other assemblies low in the area, which is maybe assembly designed for repair. And if I would like to repair something, then there are parts. And one part has to be designed for recycle, maybe the sacrifice part or the worn out part. I have to take out, recycle it, and put a new one in. But the other one is designed for reuse. So I have to have an assembly designed for repair, you have to have parts designed for recycling and designed for reuse. And there you have to tweak the different areas. And also later on, if you would, so recycling is inevitable for your product. Later on, you will have, on the end of life, you have to have some kind of recycling strategy for your product. And if you have different assemblies which are not good for the recycling process itself, maybe there's copper in the steel process, or steel, aluminum, and aluminum and copper just for the basic materials. And if I cannot get something out, or the recycling process as a technical and physical process is some kind of disturbed or not possible, then I have to take into account the joint technology of those modules or assemblies in your product to be able to separate them before you put them into a certain channel of recyclability. And so there are different steps, and also the joint technology for the repair part has to have a certain property so I do not damage the part which is designed for reuse. And those are the different steps within this design strategies. You have a product for a certain approach, you have assemblies for other approaches, and the assemblies maybe have some other approaches which are according to the first approach you have. And then you have to adjust the joint technology. That said, beforehand, as I also talked about the material, then you can see where it might be possible to sacrifice the functionality of some of the assemblies on the side, if you then can make the overall product much easier to recycle. So basically, if there's no hazardous material in my product, either for the human, the environment, or the recycling process, then I can recycle the material even better. One of the main problems you will hear about is for electronic wastes, the batteries, because you cannot just shred a product with a battery due to fire hazards, and those have to take out. And if there's no battery in the product itself, or easy to dismantle or to take out, then it's much more easy to recycle the overall electronics.
We are also seeing breakthroughs in material and manufacturing, from biodegradable plastics to regenerative composites. What new technologies or innovations are you most excited about, and how do you see them advancing circularity?
AI is the possibility to either have the data for the product a little bit better on your hands to make new decisions with, and also robotics for disassembly. So if an AI-driven system is able to use a robot or utilize a robot arm to disassemble products, depending on the information about the overall recycling mass, it is a good innovation to learn from well-engineered products to disassemble those in a certain manner, and then use this knowledge, so basically after the data from the robot, into information for yourself, and then the knowledge to disassemble other electronics which are not designed for recycling in the first place in a proper manner. And those innovations are all come together because circular economy is a change in the overall economy from the linear economy, and there are different areas. And as you said, biodegradable materials, if I have certain polymers which will break down later on in your product, then you can change it with another one. And PLA, for example, for 3D printing is very common as a material, and it is more or less a possibility to use sustainable materials for 3D printing, and therefore maybe produce a smaller part with a 3D print to keep the product longer in the life cycle. Because if maybe a small part is broken, the product is no longer good to use because some malfunctions also, and so you have a possibility to use one small 3D printed part from sustainable materials to keep your product, a well-made product, maybe longer in the circle. And also it's a possibility for each consumer to have access to spare parts, which are normally not provided because there's end of production for certain parts. And so you are able to sustain your own product within your own perimeter. And this, I think, is a big combination of different areas from the science world, or from also the shift in the society, that you say, okay, I would like to have a longer lasting product. Those are all innovations, technical wise, or in the area of the society, to change the product development and also the products in their life cycle, and later on also in their use of the materials we have put into those society and the environment.
So what does the law say about the durability of a product? For how long should you be able to repair it?
Yeah, now we can address also innovation and repair. In Germany, I have to give 2 years of warranty for my product for the consumer, so we can use it. But sometimes you have products which are so innovation prone that it's better to not have 2 years of product life cycle, because there's too much material invested in it. And especially for not the main or the mass materials like aluminum, copper and steel, but for the rare earth materials and so on. So if I have some kind of electronics, there's always a next technological innovation for the certain function those material combinations can fulfill. And to have the overall material in a certain circle, which is then put somewhere like the smartphone drawer we all have, if then the material is kept there without bringing it back because it's durable and you say, okay, it's more or less usable, then you should take into account that the bring back or the take back systems for different materials should be in this area. And therefore also it's a possibility to shift your business model from a selling point to a rent or lease point for products. And if you have, for example, the washing machine and you would like to have it a very long time because it's just a washing machine, there's no much innovation yet regarding heat, so heating and energy consumption of the washer. So it should be possible to repair over a long time. And either as a manufacturer, you can stock up on spare parts, which is expensive for yourself, or you design it in a way that a consumer is able to repair it by themselves. And this is something you have to look into as a company to make the changes if you want to, because stockpiling material is expensive and not really a big value for yourself. So designing a product that the mostly worn down or broken parts can be replaced by the consumer or by some kind of smaller craftsmanship, then it's possible to keep the product even longer. And therefore it's your responsibility as a producer, I would say, to not only provide the parts, but also the possibility to repair the materials. So access, and there's no special screw to protect something from this one. And this is valid for consumer electronics or for consumer products, not for commercial products, because I do not want to have anybody working on an elevator, for example, if he's not trained to do so. So the elevator has, of course, to be some kind of security measurements that not everybody is able to repair those materials. But for consumer electronics, it should be able to repair basically as long as the user would like to have the product in use.
Given the new production technologies such as 3D printing that are more and more prevalent, I suppose a manufacturer doesn't have to stock up anything for a long time, because with these new production technologies, he could produce on demand any part, and it will be always available if it's needed, whether it's 5 years, 10 years, or 50 years after the product has been manufactured.
Yeah, this is a good question. Production is something. When I make my initial product line, I will design it like a high-scale operation so I can make it for as cheap as possible, and therefore I configure the machinery accordingly. You can stock up a small pile of material, but the problem is later on I would like to use the machine for the next or for another production cycle. So I'm not keen as a company to have a long-lasting production cycle for a product I do not longer have, to repair those materials. And 3D printing is very expensive in a single thing if I provide it as a company, but for a user who doing it hobby-wise, or there's some kind of makerspace nearby where I can just print those materials, it's cheaper because I invest my own time as a user of the material. And therefore I can print more or less as a private person for the material cost of the material and maybe for the printer. And if I do it like an operation on a company, then I have to produce a lot of them. Or if I only print one, I have to have an engineer who's able to structure the printing process. And then small parts can easily go up to 10 euros or so. And for just a single spare part, which costs cents on the initial production process, this is a big difference then. And so it's always about economy of scale and how much is a certain material worth. So not the costs, but also the value of the material. So if I'm able to have a small part which is low cost or even high cost, but it's able to reignite a product which has a very high value or costs, then there is more value in the small part because it enables the whole product again to function. And this is for the production of materials always a problem if the machinery is not either too big in dimensions or too small in capacity wise, that you are not able to produce the certain amount for a competitive price, because there's always somebody else who tries to make his product a little bit cheaper to either have more margin or to provide a cheaper product for the consumer.
I suppose that we can make some sort of analogy with print media before the advent of internet, because now most publications are considering stopping altogether printing their newspapers and magazines. But before the advent of the internet, initially large newspapers or important magazines had to be shipped overseas in order to have a global distribution. And in time, with the advent of cheaper printing methods, they began to, instead of printing everything wherever they were based, they would have the edition sent out directly to the printing arrangements they had in a different country where they also had some sort of distribution. And this was very efficient because you could have access to your New York Times or whatever on the day it came out, and you didn't have to wait to receive it by plane 2 or 3 days later. I suppose that 3D printing and equivalent ways of manufacturing goods will follow similar routes, because you can see 3D printing machines getting cheaper and cheaper. And therefore, a car manufacturer who has cars all over the world doesn't have to stock up or have the locals stock up on the pieces, but they can have dedicated machines to just print on demand the piece that will be needed. And it would be, I can imagine this being a ubiquitous 3D printing machine. Is there something going in these directions that you're aware of?
Yeah, I think, so if we talked about business models beforehand, and sometimes you have the possibility to not buy an engine for a plane, but you buy the performance of it, or you lease or rent it. So there's all over a big engine somewhere, and the plane is also all over the world like a car. And if I have to repair something somewhere, and I have to keep all the spare parts everywhere, it's very expensive. And if you have some kind of 3D printing method, which is reliable, you just need to stock up on the material for the parts and not for the parts, not on the parts. And therefore you can print the part you need out of the material you can stock up in a very dynamic way then. Because if everything is made of the same material, then you can just print the right part, so you produce the geometry and not the material at the area where you need to have it. And therefore you will have a possibility to repair the plane then in a faster way and more reliable, because you know, okay, I need this one and that one to a certain time, and then you can produce the material at the certain location. Like you said, with the printing process for the print media, can ship more or less via the internet the CAD file, so the digital information, and then everyone else can use it. And there's already certain platforms on the internet where you can download your CAD, your 3Ds, to just print it somewhere else to have a repairable part for a certain common good, which is known for breaking in some area. So even the end consumer can just stockpile PLA material, which is again new material, and then print the part they need and not have to buy all the parts you need for a certain repair, which is most likely possible for a lot of material, but not for all material. And again, security is a problem. If you have, for example, a car in Germany, it's very strict to have a car and use some kind of technical knowledge about it. And you cannot just put anything on a car. For example, the braking system has to be in a certain way. And maybe it's not the best idea to have a 3D printed braking disc on your car. You just assume that this is a white one and will last.
Well, I suppose especially for car parts, there are big groups that manufacture, and they don't have the brakes that you're talking about. They're not just fitting one model of cars. Just a little anecdote. I wish that was available right now, because I have a motorcycle that was manufactured in 2011. And a plastic part in the circuit breaker system has broken. It's not working. And there are no more parts for this model available anywhere. There are parts for the previous model and for the next model, but for that specific model, it's not available. The manufacturer doesn't have any stock. So that's very complicated. We have to find a second-hand one, and that's not working anymore. Disassemble it, and hopefully it will be integrated. So sorry for this little anecdote.
No problem. Actually, I have some kind of bachelor thesis, which is directly addressed to 3D printing to repair older motorcycles. So this is something I come on. And there's also another company nearby, and they specialize on 3D printing for luxury cars, so Bentley from the 60s or so, to provide repair parts. And this is also a possibility to indeed integrate those and so the cost of the product for your circuit breaker is maybe low, but you cannot achieve it, and otherwise your motorcycle will not run properly. So the value of the product is very, very high just for the spare part, because otherwise you cannot use your motorcycle. And another anecdote, I have an older car from the company called Saab, and they are no longer in business, and to get spare parts is very hard to come by.
This shows the importance of coming up with new methods for spare parts and maintaining or extending the life cycle of products. But let's get back on track.
Yes.
Even with great tools and intentions, there are still obstacles. Where do you see the biggest technical bottlenecks that stop circular systems from scaling?
Time and money, as always. So I need more time and more sophisticated design methods to make my product truly circular. And you have to think about it a little bit longer than on a typical process, because you have to change the way you did it before. And also you have to educate your workforce, not only the engineers, but also all the production processes and so on, to adapt to this one. So it takes time and money during a transition phase from linear economy to circular economy. And this is the very dangerous area for a company to change everything, and therefore change your revenue outcome for the next years and also your market position for the consumer itself. So you never know in a bigger company what are your customer base are. Do they like circular economy, or do they don't like circular economy? Because if they do not want to buy the cheap product, as I mentioned before, cheap products for circular economy, but a more high value product, which is then a little bit more expensive, depending on what kind of product this is, for the car again, or if it's maybe something for the daily life, then you can change the outcome in a company revenue-wise, and then you have to adapt. And as I said before, it's very high scale, and then the economy of scale is very important to produce machinery. And right now you might have a certain machine park in your company which is adapted to the linear economy. So a lot of production in a short time, and then you have your material you can use, and then you change the production process later on. To shift to this area, you have to either use other machinery, which is less performant because they don't have to, and then you change your amount of material and products to scale down to the perfect scale area for your machinery. And therefore you have most likely to scale down the company on certain areas and points, but also the education and the willingness of all your workforce to transform to this model. And of course, as I mentioned before, you have as a company most of the time competitors. And if they still produce like the linear economy, your initial higher quality and higher cost material can be failed to be adapted to the market, and therefore the consumer purchases something from the competitor, and they do not longer have the need for, let's say, 2 or 3 years to buy something from you. And this can be very, very dangerous for a company to change in that way, and basically to lose half of the customer base to another company, because you made this step in the right direction, but it's expensive. Sometimes I would like to compare the transition to circular economy a little bit like education for younger people. You have to invest at the beginning and you get not much out of it, but later on it's very important to have the right education for the process. And this is also valid for the circular economy then.
It's one thing to redesign a product, it's another to redesign a business model. Changing to circular models often means changing business models, which isn't always easy. What are the most significant economic barriers that organizations face when they try to adopt circular practices?
Good question indeed. I would say it's again the willingness of the consumer to buy the product which is changed, because your customer base is based on your historic legacy of your products and your company. And to change it more or less the image of the company. And this is dangerous in a way that the consumer is no longer able to understand what you are doing as a company or to provide a reliable product. And then the certain design strategies will maybe force the consumer to think more about your product. And depending on what kind of product it is, he or she is maybe not even interested in thinking about product. So if I buy a certain product, which is not that expensive, I just want to purchase something. And then I go on with my life. I'm not starting to make Excel lists like for a car purchase that I see, okay, how much this costs and that costs. So to convey the information as a company that the product you will purchase as a consumer is more circular and maybe also keeps the value and the value process within your region so that your society and your community can thrive because there's workforce, a clean environment, and good social impact for your materials. This is something everyone has to understand, and therefore education of the society is also an important part. So if you go too much ahead as a company in the circularity area, then your base of the customers is able to adapt to your strategy. Then you develop products for a non-existing customer base. And this is a problem very hard to get by and to grasp, I would say, because you cannot rightly measure how far the society is into circular economy. So at least I don't know how, but you have to make a product for the customer itself and to provide something which is useful and then convey the information to the consumer, which is easier today because it's more transparency for your production process and what will happen later on with your product. But the consumer also has to find this information. There's no printed newspaper where you can announce it for the right people because it's no longer consumed in that way. And the consume of information also changes. It's very targeted depending on what you already like, but depending on the media outlet you consume, it's not even in there or not even targeted at you. This is also a very multinational problem, I would say, for the society.
There's also the question of timing. How should businesses and policymakers weigh those short-term costs against the long-term gains?
Yeah, that's a good question. I always say that the circular economy is an investment in the first product cycle. And later on, if you're able to get all your materials you need for the next product cycle out of your initial product, you can either crush down all your material into recycling. So you just have the materials back to make the next product out of it. And then you know where your material is, what it is, and how you can get your hands on it again to let the next product cycle work on it. And therefore you have a better reliable source for your materials you need and a cheaper possibility to get by. So in the first cycle, it is more expensive to produce your product. But in the next one, it's maybe even cheaper than before because you know where your materials are and how you can utilize it for your product. And then you have a competitive advantage regarding the competitor. This is something I will say has to be some kind of possibility that the public sector or the government gives some kind of incentive that you can say, okay, I would like to do this transition, but therefore I need help for the common good to bring my circular product onto the market. Maybe there's a difference in the value-added taxes and so on, so that you have a possibility to be competitive still, to make the transition and maybe deposits on your area to bring a product to the consumer for a certain price the consumer also can afford. Because if I have something just pricing has doubled and nobody's able to purchase this anymore or not in a sensible manner, then it is also something, again, if the product is too expensive for the consumer, then they will not buy it. Either they don't buy anything or they buy a cheaper alternative. And therefore there has to be some kind of incentive to transition yourself to circular economy and your company without the danger that you're going off the market because you do the right thing in both. So you try to do the right thing, but there's someone else who does not care about circular economy and just produces anything from anywhere and bring it to the market and then get your market share. So this is always a possibility. And as I said before, you have to do good and talk about it. It always said that you as a company start to say, okay, we transfer to circular economy. There might be another company who say, oh, there's openings market share then because I know I can address his customers in another way, that we will go with the old ways of producing. And this is always a problem to position yourself right on the market. And as I said, timing is also very important. And then you have to have a certain, I would say, incentive from the governance that you bring your product in the right way up to the market.
Can you give us examples of products and companies who went through redesigning products where the initial new production of that product, taking circularity in mind or keeping circularity in mind, was expensive, but then successive generations became much cheaper to produce?
I can give you, first of all, I'm not willing to name names here, but there was a car company which produced a very high-class car with recycled materials in the wheel housing. And because it was the very high-quality car and the very expensive one, the customer said, I would like to have virgin materials and not some recycled materials. And so the car flopped just as a step in the right direction, but they said, no, I don't want to have this. Most of the time for circular economy approaches and material sourcing and the recycling processes, the company knows this. Those is their more or less IP, secret IP most of the times, company knowledge and so on. So they are not very open with their savings and so on, because then they are more transparent for the other companies. But where I can imagine it's very important for battery production for electric vehicles, that can source your own materials, and they start to address it very intensively also in research to get out the materials out of the old traction batteries to bring it back to the next generation. And therefore, I'm not rely on some uncertain supply chain for my materials. And then I have a very good advantage because I can plan ahead with my material I already have. And also changing of a business model. Most of the time as a consumer of an electric car or as a user, you did not buy the battery. So it's basically a leased battery or a rented one, and you bring it back. So I, as a company, do not even give the battery rate to someone else, but I still control where it is and how I can get back to it. And then I can re-input the material into the next product generation, maybe even more performant. Then have a better quality of a product for a cheaper price because I purchased the material early on in the first life cycle, bring it in the product. The performance of the product can be increased by research and so on. And my next product life cycle, maybe I can use the material from the first life cycle to build 2 new versions, therefore. And this is a possibility where research not for steel and aluminum, obviously, but for all these more critical materials in the EU and so on.
Okay, so circularity might not always be the right solution. What industries or use cases are there where it might be inefficient or even counterproductive?
Sourcing of raw materials. So for mining and so on, if I would like to mine a product and I bring it to the market and then the market is saturated with my primary resource, then I have killed my customer base basically. And also for hygienic and security-prone materials, like I mentioned before, the braking system, you would like to have the right material and not some experimental material. Also for food production, it's not for certain materials, it's not able to use recycled polymers for food containers because there's some kind of harmful effects. If you always have some kind of circularity, hazardous materials can be accumulated on a certain extent. And this is then a problem, not only for food production, but also for harmful chemicals in other materials and also harmful metals or chemical elements in steel, aluminum, and so on. So if you always use the same material, then also the bad material isn't going out. In circularity approaches, there's some kind of, let's say, kidney function that you have a possibility to filter out this material, which is harmful for the environment. Because otherwise you can accumulate the too high amounts of it. So therefore it could be harmful if you do not use for a certain first approach on your material. Do not use, I would say, virgin materials instead of circular materials.
You mentioned IP, the intellectual property aspects of the redesign. And I would imagine that in some cases, this is one of the reasons manufacturers are not allowing access to the products under the warranty period of their products. There might be other reasons than IP, because I suppose electronics could be transformed into something they were not designed to be. How should that be prevented?
Yeah, that is a good question. Again, business model is also a term then. If I bring a product to the market and be open about the repairability, there's the Fairphone company you might know. They are very open about how you can change the materials and the most prone parts to broke. So to switch the screen, it's very easy to do so. And therefore, they have to be very open about their design structure and so on. And then there's also a possibility if your business model is to bring a product on the market for a cheaper price than the competition and then provide the spare parts to repair it and earn money with that way. So basically with the service of the material, then you also have a problem if you are very open about your structure, because then next material is not OEM quality and so on. This is something you can think about. The IP of a product, sometimes in mechanical engineering, you don't even apply for a patent, because then you give out your knowledge about your process. And this is also something in circular economy. You have to be transparent about your parts and the product and what kind of a material it has to be. And then you tell everyone what kind of material it is. And if I do not want to tell someone what material it is, I'm not able to say, okay, it's circular, you have to recycle it that way and bring it together with this material, because I'm not willing to tell anybody what is in there, and also the structure-wise and so on. So IP is always, IP and company secrets are there for a reason, but I know that also patenting is a two-edged sword, I would say, because there is a possibility to have a broader audience addressed with the patent I would produce. But if I do not earn money on it, how is my incentive be there to do research and development in the first place for the better product? If I'm not gaining the money back, at least I invested in it. And this is a problem. And therefore, I think patents were invented in the first place due to the fact that this should be an incentive to produce something and then get your money back for the research you did.
I suppose that's probably one of the main complaints companies have about laws that force them to open up their business model to allow for the repairability by users, because they are giving away some control over the products and open themselves up to being attacked by competitors. I suppose that's one of the problems the printing industry has, company producing printers, because they make a lot of money with the laser cartridges or the inks. And if they allow competitors to enter that part of the business, they are losing a big chunk of their revenue. So they put chips that are only recognized by the machine. But to some extent, balancing the rights of consumers and the repairability with the intellectual property of companies who are manufacturing goods is not always easy for the legislator. Maybe we could zoom out a little to the global stage, because when circularity scales, it's not just companies that change. Trade patterns, resource flows, and even geopolitical relationships start to shift. If we move away from virgin resource extraction, global trade dynamics could shift. What do you think circularity means for countries that rely heavily on raw material exports?
I think it's a very, not unfair, but complicated path to go to. Because let's say as Europe, we need certain materials, we source it from all over the world until we have enough for our circle and the circular economy. And then we do not no longer need the production of the material from the other countries, which is very bad because we harm their source of income. And we have all the materials we need to live a fulfilled life with all the materials we have here. And therefore it's dangerous to just assume we can take, and then say, okay, you are no longer needed for our production process, because even in a very good circular economy, you need virgin materials. And the next step is then that the trade routes will be lower, because I do not need anymore so much more of the material anymore, but they still have to source it. And basically, if you dig for material and you dug up all the first layer of it, then you have to dig deeper. And if you dig deeper, it is more expensive, and then the material gets more expensive. So you need less material, and therefore the price is increasing on two fronts, either for the production and also because there's less material. I think I'm always one of those who say, if you trade with somebody, there's less potential that we'll have some kind of war with that. So basically trade is good for the environment and also for the peaceful area, because everyone is working together on something bigger. And if you say, okay, I do not longer need your material, maybe there's some kind of incentive to be an attacking nation, which might be happening in the world sometime. And again, due to the fact that you do not longer have economic connections to another country, there's no reason to be nice, which frankly is very mean to say, but sometimes it is that way. And if there's somebody who's more sophisticated with the product, with the lifestyle and so on, or suggestively more sophisticated, then there's some kind of envy, harm and so on, which will then lead to ill intent in some areas, I would say. So it is dangerous to just rely on the circular economy and then say, I do not need anybody else for my products now, so please leave me alone. And this is also something I would say is harmful for the developing nations, that they are working hard to extract the material and then they do not even get some of the products we produce because they can't even afford the material after we said we do not longer need your production.
This is a complicated aspect because there's always competition for selling most raw products. And if extracting something becomes more expensive because you have to dig deeper, and there's a competitor who can still access it on the first level and then is able to have a production of that raw material at a cheaper price, then the one who needs it will turn to that supplier.
Yeah, this is also a problem. It gets more expensive if I dig a tunnel to get to the next layer, and I can decide as a main producer of the material whether I would like to make the tunnel safe or not. So if I make some kind of safety measurements and security, that there's no misfortune happen to the guys who go down there and dig for the material. So basically, if I neglect security, I can produce a cheaper product, which then has the competitive advantage. And this is every time a problem, because if you produce something in let's say in environmental safe and also safe for the people who work there, then it is more expensive. Therefore, if there is some kind of cost pressure for the producer of the material because they do not longer want to pay the high amount of money, there's a possibility that they cut the corners for the common good of the area where the material is produced, and also for health and safety reasons for the people who live there. Most of the time, there is some kind of criminal endeavor nearby on those raw material production sites. Not everywhere, of course, but there is an incentive to produce something, to use something, to have a better position on the market because the material is cheaper. And the supply chain is not even so transparent that they can see where the material is coming from. Therefore, in Germany, there's a law regarding your supply chain so that you have to prove as a production company where is the material coming from and under what conditions this is produced. And the next step for global trade is the so-called CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Act, where I have to pay as a European company, where I have to pay for the CO2 emitted elsewhere. So I can outsource my dirty product steps to somebody else. They produce it and pay the price for it. And then I import the material and have a higher quality material, but on a less sustainable way produced. This is also something, there are laws and so on which addresses those problems. But as always, it's very hard to be ahead of the competition to make some kind of law that is able to address a problem which has not yet occurred in the safety. So I think it's a policy-making problem and very hard to address every time. Safety, security, environmental hazards, and so on.
Our current trade system were built for linear flows: export, import, discard. Are today's trade rules and standards flexible enough for circular flows, or do we need to rethink the frameworks completely?
That's indeed, again, a good question. Trade is always, if you have a big ship for containers, then it should be never empty. So always transporting something. If I only do it in one way, then I have to charge double the amount for the way because the ship has to go back, basically like the taxi driver. And if I only produce here and never have some kind of things to ship back, then it's a problem for the logistics in terms of reliability, because there's not that much incentive if there's a better alternative where one can always produce something back and forth. And flexible enough, I would say yes, but there's also, then again, we come to societies in different countries. If, for example, the company is sourcing material from a developing nation and pays a very small price for the material because it was sourced on not the most best practices for the production of the material, they do not have the money to buy any of my products I produce. And if so, there's no reason for the ship to bring something back to that country, because the only thing is going there is money and not some kind of goods and materials. And this is think, too linear, and I think it will stay linear at least, because there's no incentive to bring something back if nobody has the money to buy something for. So it's very interesting to see there are countries with very high amount of rare earth or raw materials, but they never have the kind of money to buy the valuable goods we produce somewhere else. Because this inequality is very problematic for the real circular economy worldwide. Because I produce something nobody else can buy, and this is something I addressed before on a smaller scale, in a certain region. Even in Germany or in Europe, there are regions where there's a lot of money and regions where there's not that much of money. And so I can produce my product on a certain quality and then for everybody, or on a higher quality and then only for a certain set. And as I said before, circular economy transfer costs more money to bring the product to the market. And therefore, it's only for a certain amount or a certain area of the society, which is, again, not fair. So there are dangers regarding circular economy that it will be only for the privileged one, I would say.
You rightly bring up the question of fairness. How do we make sure circular transitions don't leave poorer countries behind or create new inequalities?
If I use material every time and every time and every time, the one who sourced it in the first place have to be rewarded in some way. So if I purchase some material somewhere else in the world, then we'll say it would be nice if this is recycled here, that they get something from the value created due to the recycling, because they made it possible in the first place. And if not, why should they bring some kind of material there if you are no longer participating in it? If you can see, okay, this source of income or this material flow will dry up sooner or later. So it is some kind of business which I know will be over soon. And this is not something I would like to invest in if I don't have to. And therefore, I think circular economy is something, this is again, some innovation regarding information is important. So I can see, okay, I produce material which is used in this product. This product is going around and around and around. And there's multiple cycles of added value to the product and also to my material I sourced in the first place. So I think maybe a fee or some kind of participation for the companies or the countries dug up the material in the first place would be fair, because they participated somewhere in the first place.
If I'm not mistaken, the pharmaceutical industry behaves this way, more or less. When there is a natural compound that only exists in one part of the world and they're able to synthesize this to use it to produce medicine, there is some sort of compensation that goes towards the indigenous people living in that part of the world, because it was discovered there, it only exists there, and synthesizing it means that you don't have to take the natural resources directly from nature, but you still recognize that it comes from there. But I'm not very clear on that, and we'll have to look up to see how exactly that works. But global transitions don't happen in isolation. They rely on collaboration. Knowledge, tools, and technologies need to be shared if circularity is to work across different economies. So innovation is only half the story. The other half is access. What kinds of international collaboration have you seen make a real difference in spreading circular economy solutions across borders?
I would say business-wise, it's hard to grasp, but there's always, of course, research and innovation. So universities are keen on working together on circular economy, because depending on where you are in the world, your circularity model, which is valuable for the environment, may differ. So there was one project we had, and there was a company or a research institute from Sweden. In Germany, you have some kind of deposit for your glass bottles to bring it back. And this might not be, again, a logistical problem. If you bring something to the northern area of Sweden, there's not much incentive to bring it back, because it will cost more money than you can save the environment for, because if there's a truck who brings back all the bottles in a bottle shape, it's not the valuable one. So if you just crush them and have some kind of shards to bring back, it's easier to transport because it's not all the volume, and then you have dismantled the product, basically, the bottle. So depending on where you are in the world, your circularity approaches are not the same. As we said before with the repairability, for example, You have to be able to produce the spare parts somewhere else. And therefore, you have to adjust your circular approach there. So if I have a working business model for circular economy and circular product possibilities within Germany, it might be not even valuable in, for example, the Netherlands or maybe in France. That is not the same area, and maybe there's also primary resources which will be produced exactly there. So it's not the best idea to bring something secondary material-wise into an area where the primary resource is much cheaper than the secondary materials, also for the environment. So working together on those areas is, I would like to say, to investigate why a certain circular approach or circular business model is working, but then be able to tell somebody else, okay, this is working here. How can we adjust it for your area? Because circular economy doesn't have to be necessarily all over the world in one big circle, but in smaller circles regional-wise, so that the region for a certain product will work together, and for other products will work maybe a whole country, then the whole continent, and maybe for other materials and sources, the whole world together, depending on how complex the materials and the products are.
You bring up something really interesting. I wasn't thinking we would be discussing it, but maybe there is, in some countries, some reflection on a social scale on how to provide the poorest segment of the population with some moderate income. So you said bringing back glass bottles in Germany is not something efficient. In other countries, I noticed that you can get money back if you bring back tin cans or PET plastic bottles. But the amount of money that you get back if you are of middle class is so low that you don't always worry about that. And by offering that possibility for very poor people, they get some sort of income.
So there is I would say, a market for the deposit. So the take-back system for the beverage cans or the glass bottles and so on. There are in bigger cities, there's also initiatives where say, okay, if you have deposit bottles, do not throw them in the trash because other people have to pick out the bottles from the trash then, which is more or less not fair. And so sometimes there's a trash can, and on the same lamppost, for example, there's also a crate for beer bottles so that you can deposit your beer bottle there for somebody else to pick up and bring somewhere. But also, as you mentioned, money-wise, they are also working like economics. They prefer the tin cans because they got 25 cents from a can and only 8 cents for a bottle. And the bottle is much heavier than the tin can. So it is more viable for them to collect the old cans and not the bottles. Even though sometimes they just skip the bottles altogether because it's too heavy to transport. So this is something for the lower market to provide a possibility to collect the, not trash in this case, but the secondary material, to be in some kind of position or in some kind of place within the circular economy. To not get the short end of the stick, but to get a piece of the cake, I would say. And therefore, it is a possibility to use deposits for products to make some kind of incentive for somebody else to bring back. It's the same with scrap metal. There are people who collect scrap metal because there's money to be made with. And this is a possibility to be there. But those are most in the informal sector there and not the formal sector. So if it's valuable to make some kind of income tax for people who collect beverage cans to get a little bit more money and to have some kind of more governments, is not the right way to do so. So I think you have to tolerate some kind of informal sector, and as long as it's not criminal behavior.
It gets complicated with some products such as scrap metal and copper, because there's the temptation of stripping and robbing construction sites of their supplies and to remove the copper that is available, or to take scrap metals from construction sites in order to have them recycled. And that is something that has to be thought about somehow.
Yeah, it also is, sometimes it is addressed on a technical, but it's possible to address it on a technical way. And I think gold, for example, depending on the structure, has some kind of fingerprint or footprint you can always recognize on the smallest molecular level, so that you know where material is coming from. And also for diamonds, I think. And they do it against the blood diamonds and so on. And to get back a little bit more to the recycling area, And black plastic is always a problem for the sensors for a certain sorting process to identify. And there is a possibility to mix markers into the primary resource or secondary resource, basically for the plastic pellets and so on, so that you know as a producer in a certain process to see, okay, this is that plastic and this is one of that plastic. But it's more expensive to do so. But then you can separate two different but same looking black plastics from each other. And this is also a problem. And to make some kind of structure to identify material, either to know which kind of material it is, or it's stolen in this case. The Deutsche Bahn, the train company in Germany, they always have problems that somebody stole the copper cables and so on. Because, there's a spool of copper, at least a ton, and this is 8,000 euros or more. Then you better keep it on a closed area for the construction site.
Many of the technologies that support circularity are protected by patents. Do you think intellectual property rights help drive innovation, or do they sometimes prevent fair access to circular tools?
I think intellectual property is an enabler for innovation, but could also be a barrier for innovation. Because if I have an innovation only on my company and there's a lot of market to be addressed with, and I'm the only one who is able to address the market, then I also can, by licensing, allow other people to produce the same material. But we saw it firsthand for medicine and the COVID pandemic and so on. So the process to produce the vaccination was able to do so, but they would not let other people to do this because they would like to have their investment back. And if I'm not able to get my investment back on my innovation I will do, the innovation will be a little bit problematic. And there's always patents not running for eternity, but for a certain amount, and then you can renew it. I think you have to innovate, and therefore you have to be incentivized, not just for doing so. Maybe it's happening, but not always. But if it's security-wise, then it's a very important thing to not be greedy about your investment. And then maybe have a possibility to share it with the whole world and then to get some kind of return back for this one, which not necessarily be money-wise. Because money is only a tool and not the main reason why we should do everything on the planet, I would say. And therefore there's one directly impact from Clausthal-Zellerfeld. The steel wire cable was invented here and it was not patented. And so it's going all over the world in a very short time because the steel cable was replacing steel chains. And in mining operations, if a steel chain, one link broke, the chain was broken. And so the transfer to the steel cable were very much a step forward security-wise because the death rate goes down after the invention. And so this is, I think, a good example where innovation was a good thing for all over the world because it made so much more processes more secure.
How do you see the role of advanced economies when it comes to sharing knowledge, tools, and infrastructure with countries that are just starting to build circular capabilities?
Yeah, that is very, very complicated, I would say, because we have some kind of responsibility to tell somebody else which directions for productions do not work in the long term. Long term in terms of I can do it now to have a better life, but later on I have a problem because I produce all the waste. And to say somebody else, okay, you are not allowed to have your positive impact on your life right now because later on it's a problem for you. And I say it to somebody else and therefore prohibit him to do so. That's not fair. But it's right. And this is a very complicated matter, I would say. Then it's again for the IP that I tell somebody, okay, this is a way we already walked on. And it's not the right path to do the transformation to a circular or to a sustainable future. So we do this and that, and therefore I have to share my IP to tell them, okay, this one's the right way. It takes a little bit longer, but in the long term you have less problems. And therefore I have to open up in how far I can produce something. But then this is also, again, a problem regarding rich countries that they have to make a product in the area which is able to be produced somewhere else and then to be afforded somewhere else. And this is, for example, by software. I can sell software all over the world, but I will not charge the same price for some software here in Germany than I would do somewhere else in the world, because the money I can assume the customer to pay for my software is differently. And this is a problem with physical products if they are produced in a certain area, and therefore either I produce more and sell it for a lower price to somebody else in another region. But then over the long term, I can get back my money due to the services I would provide. And then again, if I have a service business model where I earn money with the service on my product, and I have an open intellectual property policy, then I enable other people to produce the spare parts I need for my part. And this is such a complicated matter. So all the transformation from circular economy and the multi-level and also the global area is not just complicated, it's indeed complex, because you never know what's next and what problems will arise after the next transformation step onto a circular economy.
All this takes more than market forces, benevolence, or goodwill. It also takes governance, the right rules, incentives, and partnerships to make circularity not only possible, but preferable. Policy shapes incentives, and it can either help or hinder systemic change. Which types of policies have you found most useful or powerful in accelerating circular transitions?
Yeah, good question. Hard to pinpoint this certain area, because the incentive for one company could be a disadvantage for another one. And therefore, to measure it in the right way that you say, okay, it's a net positive for the circular economy, it's hard to say. Because in a circular economy, I would say everyone is thriving sooner or later. And if not, this is a problem. And if I bring some kind of incentive one company will transfer to, and then have, okay, my incentive was there, I transformed the company towards a circular economy, but the other one didn't, and therefore the company will broke down, and we go bankrupt and shut down the production, then there's a lot of unemployment in that area where the company was primarily. So by incentivizing some kind of step into a circular economy, I bring the more or less valuable business models to another position where they have to either adjust or go off the market. And you have to be careful that you not over-incentivize a certain area so that you basically get a monopoly again for some production. In Germany, there's no real direct incentive to transform to a circular economy, but there are indirect incentives because there are some kind of laws, prohibitions, and penalties to be made with. I always think it's a wrong way to just penalize somebody who's making some kind of valuable material or product in this certain time, but to have some kind of incentive to transform to a circular economy in a certain way. And this is always a very problematic approach, even for the policy and governance. In Germany, the voting period is for 4 years, so they try to focus on those 4 years and not on the next 40 years. And it's hard for somebody to even grasp the circular economy, be in a position to decide where the country is going, and then to see it for a long term in a 20 years period or so, or 40 years, to even do this in a lifetime. So once somebody asked me if I would like to do some of the engineering stuff I did on my thesis, and I said, no, it's a lifetime work to do, and I'm not even finished then. Because you have to learn a lot, education again, to be there, and then implement those changes after your ideas and convince other people to make a government, and then change the next 20 years in that way. In my opinion, there's nothing I would say, not nothing, maybe there is something I don't know about, but to transform to circular economy in that area we are in, due to the fact that we're just learning about circular economy and all the rebound effects there maybe are. It's hard to say that there's some incentive which is just right.
Yeah, you're raising an issue that is plaguing all countries and all transformation needed within countries, social or technical or technological, because politicians are all elected for short periods of time. And if they want to project the country into the future, sometimes they have to start or initiate changes that will take more than their mandate, and the effect of which will not be seen immediately, but they will transform the way people go about doing their business. And the rewards of that changes will come maybe 5, 6, or 10 years down the road. And those might be very unpopular decisions to take. And if they do take them, they will not be reelected. Yeah. So we are in this complicated paradigm where if they take those decisions and they are not reelected, those who are reelected in their place might make promises where they will stop those changes and then go back to a different system and the needed changes will not be implemented as they should be.
Yeah, this is, again, as you mentioned, and if I make a policy which leads to very positive outcome in the future, but negative in the past at a certain time and right now, so for example, and that some parts, those the lower 10% income-wise of the population is not able to afford food anymore, this is a problem. Indeed, this is a very, very big problem if somebody is not able to even have the basic needs met. And therefore, indeed, it's very strange that, for example, education is a very good tool to let the society thrive. But political-wise, it's seldomly touched. Just because, okay, I will invest in education. This is just costing money, and you cannot really pinpoint how much revenue you will get later on for your investment, which is normally what companies care about. But it's needed to transform the all-over area and possibility into a next future for the technology we produce somewhere else. So not only is this financially wise, but also educational wise. You have to learn so much more than 50 years ago because there's so much interdisciplinarity between all the areas. And this is also valid for politicians. They have to learn so much more in the position they are to adjust to the situation we are in. That is very hard, in my opinion, to tell a politician they should do this and that because this will transform the right direction, as they do not even have the right information to do so or have not the proper education because there's so much new material now. You have to learn to even react on a certain market in a certain way. I think the velocity in which you have to learn new stuff in the last 10 years or so is so much increasing so that you're not even able to learn new things beside your daily tasks. And this is a problem for different areas because 50 years ago, the world was different. 20 years ago, the iPhone didn't exist. So it changed.
Yes. The younger generation must wonder how the hell were we able to go about our lives without our iPhones. But to try to get a little bit more specific, sometimes the real obstacles aren't lack of innovation, but existing regulations or market distortions. Are there specific policies like subsidies or outdated norms that hold us back?
Good question I have to think about. If you have some kind of fast-moving innovation products and I have to give some kind of 2 years warranty for my product or safety-wise or, for example, the cars, the petrol engine and diesel engine cars which are produced today, is it likely that they are needed to run for 20 years and therefore is it necessary to invest all the materials in there? In other terms, is it right to produce high-quality petrol engine cars nowadays? And I have to make some kind of sacrifice if I would like to produce a car. But on the other hand, I think you do not have to make it that viable, but you have to make it because there's a policy you can keep the car for 2 years. And this is also for smartphones, not anymore, but laptops and so on is still very prone to change. And you produce material and basically bind material in there just because you have to make it for 2 years. And I think the transition in the building sector is also very viable because there are so much more regulations there that you're not even able to produce a building. And after you build it, then there are new restrictions on the energy consumption of a building nowadays. You would like to get down on the heating equipment, the appliances and so on. And you have to take into account a lot of different areas and restrictions which was set in place 20 years ago or so that still have to be enforced, but it's no longer useful to do so. But I cannot exactly pinpoint a certain directive. I would say this is a wrong approach. But I know there are certain approaches. Yeah.
That would be an interesting incentive to get people to move to a different, cleaner technology. If you said that from now on we have changed the law and the engines in your new car should only work as intended for 5 years. After that, if they break down, it's acceptable. That would get people to think about their future purchase differently if the law that governs the production of clean cars is different and say that they have to continue working for 20 years. Because now it's the opposite. It is electric cars that have a limited life expectancy because of the prohibitive cost of replacing the battery. So if you buy an electric car and you plan to use it as you were using your diesel cars or petrol cars and hope to do 200,000 kilometers because you travel a lot, your car is probably not going to be able to provide you the comfort that you get from a diesel engine.
Yeah, and this is as you mentioned, I think there are plans, I'm not sure if they're already set in place, that in Germany the end consumer, so the user of the petrol car, has to pay for the CO2 emitted by the petrol. And therefore they say that the prices will rise about 80 cents, so from 2 euros to 3 euros basically. And this will increase the operation costs of petrol cars. The cars were built for 20 years, but then it's something that you are not even to afford moving the car, which is the problem for a car if you cannot afford to move it. Those are different areas, and I think they have to be considered also in the product development, that you say, okay, nowadays we see this is a technology, we are still good at making petrol engines and diesel engines here in Germany, but the technology maybe runs out someday, and therefore we have to focus on another transfer. And then to allow those producers to make less reliable cars for the certain amount, this will change, and also the purchase, because if I know I buy a new car for 30,000 euros and there's no reliability that I can use it 5 years later, which is, for example, Windows, as always, the service period ends. Nobody is complaining about this one because the former Windows version is obsolete and no longer used. So service ends. And this is, again, we talked about cars and motorcycles beforehand. The service ends. And then you do not even able to purchase the right part for your motorcycle to bring it back on the certain working level. And that way you have invested way too much material, money and production on the rest of the motorcycle if there's some small part broken. So you could have made all the other parts, even as an engineer, you are able to produce something for a lifetime, and you can define the lifetime there. So there are different areas where you can say, okay, this doesn't have to take that long and use that long, and even so some parts are used that often. The rear engine to reverse the car is made for 100 hours of operation because you do not even use it that hard. If you design the rest of the gearbox also for 100 hours of operation, this would be a problem for the end consumer. They will say, oh, this is not a good thing. And therefore you have to adjust all the parts in your products for a certain lifetime and for a certain lifespan. But in the next step, if the government, again, gives not an incentive to transform, but a prohibitive incentive for you, then this is a complex thing for a company to adjust to or to take into account while designing a product.
Circularity also needs collaboration. What makes a public-private partnership work when it comes to systemic change?
I think there is a possibility that the public service can take the risk for the operation, and the private part of the public-private partnership can bring the efficiency, or even not even all the times efficiency, but sufficiency for the product or service provided. So that there's no negative incentive for the company who is able to produce something for the public-private partnership, which the public then will benefit from, but has to invest the money beforehand. And this is something the public has to do, so basically the people of the area around it. And so you have to invest maybe tax money into it, and just to bring it up to speed and that the system is running. And then the company who is able to produce the material can bring the material to the market with an incentive or with the help of the public to provide a good or a service which is more or less good on the common good and not just for incentivized revenue. So I think this is also, for a market perspective, is not good because there's an incentive for one company and not for everyone. So you exclude somebody from the market, but then maybe the prices are not that competitive and you pay too much for the service anyway. And this is always a problem with the public-private companies, I think, that the price could be going up very, very high just because there's some kind of incentive or no incentive for the company to produce on a smaller scale. Efficiency and sufficiency is there a big problem that we got, I would say.
At the end of the day, this isn't just about systems. It's about people.
Yes.
Circularity touches how we live, work, and relates to the world around us. So we also have to ask, how do we make it fair?
Yeah, how do we get fair? This is again, it's about people. I think nowadays the most of the company and the products produced are to make money on. And sometimes there is not even a need for something. I will not name any products now, but there is no need for a certain product to be produced in the first place. But somehow via advertisement and so on, you get people to buy those. And it's not good for the environment, not good for the community. And later on, there's just not a heap, but there's a lot of trash and waste to get disposed of, which most likely the community is responsible for later on. So, and the shift to more common goods, materials and incentives to change to that area is necessary in the whole society to change towards the circular economy, because otherwise it's again just the incentive is money, and if the incentive is money, I will keep down my costs, therefore maybe my product quality and so on. So to just see, okay, maybe I'd buy a product once in a lifetime and then I inherit it to the next generations and so on. There are some parts or products which do so, but not everything.
That is the slogan of the highest end luxury Swiss watch brands, that you don't buy them for yourself. You are just keeping them for the next generation.
Yeah, okay, with this.
We often talk about materials and energy, but people are part of this system too. How can we better integrate labor rights, consumer inclusion, and fairness into how we design circular policies and products?
Big question. I would say that I mentioned before that labor rights and also security on the workplace, which is necessary for the COQ and good workplace, you need to be sure that you are not be harmed in the process to working there. But if the company is able to cut the corner to make the product a little bit cheaper, and then you sacrifice it with part of your well-being, it's not good to be though. So transforming in the circular economy is expensive. And if I'm able to cut corners for a short time of period, maybe I can make the adjustment. But then the labor rights have to be addressed. And I think labor rights is always something which includes into the workforce and also the people who produces the goods. And again, we could see that there's a shift to robotics. Robotics will not necessarily replace workforce, but make the workplaces more enjoyable because the bad workplaces are done by robots. Investment in robotic technology for a circular economy could be able to produce products which are in the production process itself harmful or dangerous, and therefore the human is not longer in danger of be harmed or so. And then you can outsource the danger labor to the robots, and you can keep the, nice jobs to the humans. And this is a possibility to change also, but there are multiple other aspects I would address in this case, but I think this is going out of hand in this question.
Okay. Culture matters too. Most of us are still trained to buy new, not repair or share. What kinds of cultural shifts do you think we need to make circularity both desirable and accessible? So you already mentioned education. Anything else comes to mind?
Certain needs. I think the newer generation will not have the need to buy a car. Even if you're living in a bigger place like a city, it's not that important to own a car, I think, because the car most of the time just standing around. And I think 3% of the energy used is just for moving the person. The rest is for moving the car and so on. So it is a very unnecessary thing to have a car owned by you. So sharing economy for cars is more sensible. But there's also something in the society you cannot always say, okay, this is the right thing to do. Sometimes people do stuff just because they want to do it, because they are fun. And if you prohibit fun or the free development of people because of some restrictions, that this is a problem. And to change the individual approach of a human into a other society to address a certain concept of living in an environment, I think it's very dangerous to do so. So changes in sharing economy or to just not buy a product because it's not the right thing to do. It's something I could see in this future will be going down in amount.
So circular projects don't always align perfectly with social realities. How do you approach trade-offs between environmental goals and potential social or economic consequences?
I think this is a problem because if I have to sacrifice something today, so people in the future will benefit, it's always hard to understand right now, because why should I do this is always the question. But if you make the life next year a little bit more livable and so on, I think it's a good thing to do. There are more catastrophes all over the place with the climate change, and there are areas and peoples who have problem with their environment, so they cannot longer live where they are. And this is, I think, a hard reality if you have to leave your hometown because the environment is no longer a good environment for yourself. And why should other people, like the EU, for example, why should we sacrifice our quality of living or standard of living because somebody else has to pay the price for this? And to see this and to address this is very hard to get into the society's minds and to realize this is real and this is in this situation right now. So you have to see the world as it is in the overall concept that there are so many people on the world and everybody should have some kind of good life to live. And if you are just saying, okay, only me, then it starts to bring people against you. And this is something you have also to take into account. There are people who will likely see your values and maybe also your richness that is not fair for them. And this is also, again, going back to the bigger picture of possibilities of war and envy then.
We've covered a lot of grounds here, and I'm sure there are a lot of blind spots, things that we haven't talked about. I wanted to ask, to conclude, something I ask all my guests. So keeping in mind the potential blind spots and things that we could have discussed, what is it that we're not talking about, but we should be?
Good questions for the blind spot. I think we are not talking about the rapid changes that happen right now in the world and how we can address them. Therefore, we have to design the newer systems in a flexible way and manner that they can address the new upcoming problems and so on. So we have to take not everything for granted and we have to design systems accordingly. And therefore, there is a lot to think about in the future. And as you said, we covered a lot of ground here, different topics, different areas. And now think about that. I try to narrow it down on the production process of a product and also the design process. So it's not easy to always think about in the solution I can have today for a company on a certain product for a certain customer base could be changing in a glimpse of an eye just because there's some change on the world. Because some kind of raw material is getting more expensive, or the market is broken down, or the trade agreement doesn't even be held anymore. So you always have to be flexible, not always to have a plan B, but to have a reliable possibility to mitigate the problems they might occur during the process of product design. And I think what we do way too often is talk about the consequences and not the reason of the problem. So there's some kind of effect we have somewhere because something happened, and we address the effect, but not the root of the cause. And this is something I think we should change a lot in different areas and systems, and to just ask ourselves, is what we are doing indeed right or not? And this is something also in recycling processes and so on, production processes. Is it right to use paper instead of polymers on a cup, for example? Is it valuable to chop down a tree instead of drilling for oil? And so there's a lot of things you can just reconsider on the knowledge and wisdom we have today, which we are using for the last 20 years, or 50 years maybe. And this is something I think we have to always to reflect if that what we're doing right now is still the right thing to do in terms of the change of the world.
Thank you, Philip. If the listeners would like to follow up on our conversation or dig a little deeper, is there anything that you recommend for reading?
Obviously, if somebody would like to know more about circular economy and the design for the products, There are some papers I wrote in this case, and otherwise I would say...
Maybe I can include them in the notes and provide links to them, so send them to me and I'll include them into the notes of the podcast.
Yeah, can do so, yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for your time, Philip, and for this interesting conversation. We've covered a lot of ground, and I understand a little bit more the challenges of circular economy, and I hope our listeners will understand that also a little bit better.
Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation. Very interesting topics indeed. And you're good at picking brains for people who think about a lot of stuff. And therefore, it's always a lot of food for thought for myself also to reconsider my position in the circular economy again.
Thank you, Philip.
Bye-bye.